I met Sarah on a crisp autumn evening at a fundraiser for the Boston Symphony Orchestra. The Grand Hall of Symphony Center was bathed in warm, golden light, illuminating the city's elite as they mingled over champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I'm not really into classical music. Give me classic rock any day, but my company had sponsored the event, and as CEO of Williams Financial, I was expected to make an appearance. The evening had been dragging on with the usual small talk about market trends and property values when I first saw her. She stood out immediately, tall and elegant in a midnight blue dress that complemented her auburn hair, which seemed to catch every glimmer of light in the room. Unlike the other attendees who circled the wealthy donors like planets around the sun, she seemed genuinely absorbed in examining a small exhibition of musical manuscripts displayed near the bar. When our eyes met across the room, she smiled, not the practiced, polished smile I'd grown accustomed to in these circles, but something that seemed refreshingly genuine. I made my way over, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. Fascinating, aren't they? I offered, nodding toward the manuscripts. Absolutely, she replied, accepting the champagne. Beethoven's original notations for his Seventh Symphony. Look at how many times he crossed out and rewrote this passage. Her voice had a slight huskiness to it that I found immediately attractive. I'm Sarah, by the way. Sarah Coleman. James Williams, I said, extending my hand. Williams Financial, she said, not as a question, but as a statement of recognition. Your company is doing remarkable work with sustainable investment portfolios. I read about your green energy fund in the Financial Times. I was caught off guard by her knowledge. Most people at these events knew my company as that successful investment firm, but few bothered to learn the details of our work. When she started asking insightful questions about our investment philosophy and long-term strategies, I was captivated. I'm an art consultant, she explained when I finally thought to ask about her. I help clients build meaningful collections, not just as investments, but as expressions of their values and aesthetics. She spoke with such passion about her work, describing how she'd helped a tech executive build a collection of emerging female artists or guided a retired surgeon in collecting Japanese woodblock prints. Most people think art collecting is about prestige or financial gain, she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. But at its heart, it's about connection, to beauty, to history, to human expression. By the end of the evening, I'd completely forgotten my usual eagerness to escape these events. We exchanged numbers, and I called her the next day to invite her to dinner. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant in the North End. I arrived early, nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. At 42, I'd had my share of relationships, including a brief, failed marriage in my early 30s to my college sweetheart. But none of those experiences had prepared me for Sarah. She arrived wearing a simple green dress that brought out the flecks of emerald in her hazel eyes. Over pasta and Chianti, she told me about growing up in Seattle with artistic parents who never quite managed to make a living from their passion, her art history degree from Vassar, and her years working for galleries in New York before branching out on her own as a consultant. I love the freedom, she said. Matching the right artwork to the right person feels like completing a puzzle that benefits everyone. The artist, the collector, and in some small way, the world. I found myself sharing more than I usually would on a first date about my parents. Small accounting firm in Western Massachusetts, my driven path through Wharton, and the early, lean years of building Williams Financial from scratch. What made you focus on ethical investing? She asked, seemingly genuinely interested. My father, I explained. He always said money was like water. It could nourish growth or erode foundations depending on how it flowed. I wanted to build something that did the former. Our courtship progressed with an intensity that surprised even me. Sarah was unlike anyone I'd ever dated. Intellectually curious, passionate about her work, and seemingly unimpressed by the trappings of wealth that had attracted previous partners. She lived in a modest apartment in Cambridge filled with books, and a few carefully chosen artworks that she spoke about with reverence. Within 3 months, we were spending nearly every night together. By 4 months, I was introducing her to my closest friends, my college roommate Michael, now a prominent attorney, and his wife Elena, my CFO Adrian and his husband Thomas, my sister Catherine who flew in from Chicago specifically to meet the woman who finally captured Jamie's heart. They all adored her. Catherine, usually skeptical of my girlfriends, pulled me aside at dinner to whisper, "This one's different, Jamie. Don't mess it up." 5 months in, during a weekend trip to Vermont to see the fall foliage, I proposed on the balcony of our B&B. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the landscape in fiery oranges and reds. "I know it seems fast," I said, down on one knee with my grandmother's diamond ring in hand. "But when something feels this right, why wait?" Tears filled her eyes as she accepted. "I never expected to find someone like you, James," she said as I slipped the ring onto her finger. "You've made me believe in second chances." We were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at a historic mansion in the Berkshires. Only 50 guests, our closest friends and family, witnessed our vows as the first snow of the season dusted the grounds outside. Sarah had planned everything with impeccable taste on what I'd considered a modest budget, insisting that we didn't need extravagance to make the day special. "It's about us, not about impressing people," she'd said when I suggested a larger venue. The first year of our marriage was blissful. We traveled together, exploring galleries in Paris, hiking in Patagonia, and spending 2 weeks at a villa in Tuscany where Sarah charmed the locals with her surprisingly fluent Italian. We renovated our Boston brownstone, blending my preference for modern simplicity with her more eclectic aesthetic. We talked about starting a family, agreeing to try after our second anniversary when a major company expansion would be complete that I introduced her to my business partners and clients, all of whom seemed as taken with her as I was. She attended company events with grace, making even the most socially awkward of my tech investors feel at ease. When we decided to renovate the office, she helped select artwork that transformed our corporate space from generic to distinctive, impressing everyone with her knowledge and taste. "Your wife has an incredible eye," my operations director commented after Sarah suggested replacing the standard corporate prints with works by local artists. "These pieces make a statement about who we are as a company." In those early days, I'd sometimes catch myself watching her as she slept beside me, wondering how I'd gotten so lucky. Sarah Coleman, now Sarah Williams, seemed too good to be true, and as it turned out, she was. The first red flag appeared so subtly that I nearly missed it. We'd been married about 14 months when Sarah suggested consolidating our finances. We were having breakfast on a Sunday morning. She was reading the arts section of the Times, while I reviewed some quarterly reports. "I've been thinking," she said casually, not looking up from her paper. "It might make sense to simplify our finances. Having separate accounts made sense when we were first married, but now it just creates unnecessary complexity." "What did you have in mind?" I asked, setting aside my tablet. "Just adding my name to your accounts, combining our investments. It's more efficient for tax purposes and easier to manage." She reached for her coffee. "Plus, if anything ever happened to you, I wouldn't have to deal with probate issues on top of grief." It made perfect sense. Being in finance myself, I appreciated the efficiency argument, and the mention of potential future scenarios showed foresight. I agreed without hesitation, calling our financial advisor the next day to begin the process of adding her name to most of my accounts. Soon after, I noticed the first shift in our spending patterns. Sarah had always been reasonably frugal, or so it seemed, taking pride in finding unique items at estate sales rather than shopping at high-end boutiques. But, gradually, her purchases became more extravagant. First, it was an Hermes bag that cost more than my first car. Then came the spontaneous weekend trips to New York for client meetings that somehow always included shopping at Bergdorf Goodman and dinners at restaurants with multiple Michelin stars. When the American Express bill hit 5 figures for the third month in a row, I gently brought it up over dinner at home. "I noticed the spending has increased quite a bit lately," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Is everything okay?" Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a momentary flash of something, annoyance, defensiveness, before settling into a look of mild surprise. "James, you make 7 figures a year. The company is doing better than ever." She reached for her wine glass. "Do you really want to nickel and dime your wife over a shopping trip? Should I start bringing you receipts for approval?" Her response left me feeling petty and controlling. "Of course not," I said quickly. "I just wanted to make sure you're happy. Sometimes shopping can be a way of filling a void." She softened, then, reaching for my hand. "I'm happier than I've ever been. And I thought we agreed that money was meant to be enjoyed, not just accumulated." She smiled. Besides, that trip to New York resulted in connecting the Andersons with an emerging artist they just purchased for their collection. My commission on that sale more than covered the weekend. I apologized for bringing it up, feeling foolish. For questioning her. This pattern repeated itself several times over the next few months. I would notice something that gave me pause. Sarah would provide a perfectly reasonable explanation, and I would end up feeling like I was the one with the problem. But other inconsistencies began to accumulate. At a dinner with friends, she mentioned a meeting with a client at the Gardner Museum, discussing a particular Titian painting. Later that week, when I suggested we visit the museum ourselves, she replied, "They're actually renovating that wing right now. The Titian isn't on display." When I checked the museum's website later, not only was the painting on display, but there had been no renovations scheduled. Then there were the phone calls she would take in another room, her voice dropping to a whisper. When I asked who had called, her answers were vague, just a potential client or gallery business. Once, I distinctly heard her say, "He doesn't suspect anything," before noticing me approaching and quickly ending the call. "Suspect what?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, that." She laughed, slipping her phone into her pocket. "The Madison Gallery is planning a surprise exhibition featuring one of your favorite photographers. I'm helping them acquire a piece for it. It was supposed to be a surprise for your birthday." I wanted to believe her. In fact, I convinced myself that my suspicions were just manifestations of my own insecurities. After all, Sarah had never given me any real reason to doubt her love. The most troubling pattern emerged about 18 months into our marriage when she began encouraging me to make increasingly risky investments through channels she recommended. "My client's husband quadrupled his investment with this group," she said one evening, showing me a prospectus for a development project in an emerging market. "They're not accepting many new investors, but I mentioned your name, and they're willing to make an exception." When I looked into the investment firm, their credentials seemed solid on the surface, but something felt off. The returns they promised were just this side of too good to be true, and when I tried to arrange a meeting with their principals, I was told they were traveling abroad indefinitely. "I'm not comfortable with this one," I told Sarah after a week of research. "The risk profile doesn't match our portfolio strategy." She didn't argue but seemed unusually disappointed. "You're probably right," she conceded. "I just thought it would be good to diversify." 2 weeks later, she suggested another investment opportunity, this time in a tech startup that was guaranteed to be the next unicorn. Again, the details were vague, the principals mysteriously unavailable for direct meetings. Around this time, I also began noticing small discrepancies in our joint accounts, transactions I didn't recognize, transfers between accounts that I hadn't initiated. When questioned, Sarah always had an explanation. "I moved some money to cover that art shipping invoice," or "Don't you remember? We discussed investing in that municipal bond fund last month." Had we discussed it? I wasn't certain anymore. Sarah had a way of making me question my own memory, of suggesting that conversations had occurred that I couldn't quite recall. Then came the incident that should have been my wake-up call. We were at a gallery opening in Soho during a weekend trip to New York. Sarah was chatting animatedly with the gallery owner about a series of abstract expressionist works when an elegant older woman approached them. "Sarah," the woman exclaimed, air-kissing my wife's cheeks. "It's been ages. How are you, darling?" For a split second, Sarah looked genuinely startled, even alarmed. Then her social mask slipped back into place. "Margaret, what a surprise," she said smoothly. "James, this is Margaret Whitmore, an old client from my New York days." "Lovely to meet you," I said, shaking the woman's hand. "Old client." Margaret laughed. "My dear, we were practically roommates at Burley. Your mother would be mortified to hear you calling me old anything." I felt Sarah stiffen beside me. "Margaret always had a wicked sense of humor," she said with a tight smile. "She knows perfectly well we met when I consulted on her Upper East Side renovation. Speaking of which, how is that Rothko looking in your living room?" The conversation moved on, but I couldn't shake the strange interaction. Later that night, in our hotel room, I casually asked, "So, Margaret went to Burley? I thought you grew up in Seattle." She was confused, Sarah said dismissively, removing her earrings at the vanity. "She works with so many art consultants, and she's getting up there in age." She was thinking of Rebecca Isaacs. "We're often mistaken for each other in the industry." It was plausible enough, but something in her tone made me uneasy. When she went to take a shower, I did something I'd never done before. I checked her phone. It was password protected, of course, but I knew the code from watching her enter it countless times. There were no text messages older than a month, no emails in any folder, and her call history had been cleared. For someone who claimed to run a business based on relationships and communication, the blank slate of her digital presence was odd, to say the least. The next morning, Sarah announced she needed to meet a client for brunch. It was a last-minute thing, she explained. They're only in town for the day. Why don't you enjoy the hotel spa while I'm gone? My treat. As she kissed me goodbye, I made a split-second decision. Actually, I might call Michael for a coffee. He mentioned he'd be in the city this weekend. Sarah nodded absently, already heading for the door. Have fun. I'll be back by 2. I waited 5 minutes, then followed her. Instead of heading toward the upscale restaurant where she'd claimed to be meeting clients, she walked to a small cafe 6 blocks away. Through the window, I watched her greet a man in his 60s, expensively dressed, with the confident bearing of old money. They spoke intently for over an hour, Sarah occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. Nothing definitively suspicious, but certainly not the female client she'd described. When I confronted her back at the hotel, she didn't miss a beat. Oh, that was Philip Carrington. He's representing the woman I mentioned, Andrea Lawson. She couldn't make it at the last minute, so she sent her financial advisor instead. She looked at me curiously. Were you following me, James? Put that way, my actions sounded paranoid and controlling. I mumbled something about wanting to surprise her after her meeting, and she accepted the explanation with a raised eyebrow. Next time, just join us, she said, squeezing my hand. Philip's wife is looking for exactly the kind of investment advice you specialize in. It could have been a good connection for you. Once again, I was left feeling foolish for suspecting anything, yet increasingly certain that something wasn't right. The truth came crashing down on a random Tuesday in March, about 2 years into our marriage. It was one of those perfect early spring days in Boston, the kind that makes you believe winter might actually end someday. I had a morning meeting with investors, then planned to work from home in the afternoon to prepare for a conference in Chicago the following day. That meeting ended early, and I decided to swing by our favorite bakery to pick up those chocolate croissants Sarah loved. It was an impulsive gesture, a peace offering of sorts after weeks of growing tension between us. When I arrived home around noon, Sarah's car was in the driveway, which was unusual. She typically spent Tuesdays at her rented office space downtown, meeting with clients or gallery representatives. I assumed she'd come home for lunch or to prepare for an afternoon appointment that I entered quietly, planning to surprise her. The house seemed still, but I could hear her voice coming from the study. The door was slightly ajar, and I approached, with the pastry box in hand, about to announce my presence when I caught the tone of her conversation. Yes, almost there, she was saying, her voice all business, devoid of the warmth I was accustomed to. The transfer to the Cayman account went through yesterday. Another 100,000 moved to the Singapore holdings. I froze in the hallway, the pastry box suddenly heavy in my hands. No, he doesn't suspect anything, she continued after a pause. Another 6 months, and I'll have enough transferred that we can proceed with the divorce. His prenup is solid, but not if I can prove he commingled assets. I've got documented evidence of every joint decision, forged his signature on enough documents to create reasonable doubt. Another pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the line. Don't worry about the timeline. He's completely trusting, pathetically so, actually. Men like James are all the same, so convinced of their own brilliance that they can't imagine being outsmarted, especially by a woman. She laughed then, a cold sound I'd never heard from her before. The art consultant persona was perfect. He never once verified my credentials or contacts. I could have told him I was personally friends with Jeff Koons, and he would have believed it. I stood frozen in the hallway, my world collapsing around me, the pastry box now crushed in my grip. Part of me wanted to burst into the room, to confront her immediately, to see the look on her face when she realized I'd heard everything. But some instinct for self-preservation held me back. Look, I've got to go, she said. I'm meeting with that investment group this afternoon, the one I told you about. If I can get him to put even a portion of his portfolio with them, our cut would be substantial. Yes, of course they know the plan. 50% to us once they've moved the funds offshore. I heard her chair scrape against the hardwood floor and quietly retreated down the hallway and out the front door. I got into my car and sat there, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the crushed pastry box on the passenger seat leaking chocolate onto the leather interior I'd so carefully maintained. Everything suddenly made horrible sense. The inconsistencies in her stories, the pushing for joint accounts, the mysterious phone calls, the investment suggestions. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd loved and trusted completely, had been systematically planning to destroy me financially. Instead of driving back to the office as I planned, I found myself pulling into the parking garage of Michael Chen's law firm. Michael and I had been roommates at Wharton, and he was now a partner at one of Boston's most prestigious firms, specializing in both family and criminal law. He was also one of my closest friends and had been my best man at the wedding, his assistants. Eyes widened when I walked in without an appointment, probably noting my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. "Is he available?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "It's an emergency." 5 minutes later, I was sitting in Michael's corner office, the Boston skyline spread out behind him, telling him everything I'd just heard. To his credit, he listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Jesus Christ, James," he said when I finally finished. "I knew something was off about her." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "You never said anything." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "It was nothing specific, just a feeling. She was too perfect, you know? Too polished. And there was something about the way she watched you when you weren't looking. I can't explain it. But Elena felt it too. Why didn't you say something?" I felt a fresh wave of betrayal, this time from my oldest friend. "And say what?" "Hey buddy, your wife seems too good to be true. You were happier than I'd ever seen you." Elena told me I was being paranoid. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "But that's not important now. What matters is what we do next." That afternoon, I hired a private investigator recommended by Michael's firm, a former FBI agent named Diana Reeves who specialized in financial crimes. "I need to know everything," I told her. "Who she really is, where the money's going, who she's working with. Everything." "I understand," Diana said, her manner brisk and professional. "But you need to know that this investigation will take time, and during that time, you cannot let on that you suspect anything. If she realizes you're onto her, she'll accelerate her plans or cover her tracks more effectively." "How am I supposed to go home and pretend everything is normal?" I asked, the thought of facing Sarah making me physically ill. "The same way she's been pretending for 2 years," Diana replied, her eyes sympathetic but firm. "Consider it an investment in your future." That night, I went home and gave the performance of my life. I smiled at the woman who was systematically robbing me. I ate the dinner she prepared. I even made love to her when she initiated it, fighting back nausea the entire time, remembering her cold laugh and dismissive words about me. The next day, I flew to Chicago for my conference as planned, grateful for the reprieve from the charade. While there, I opened a new personal bank account at a bank I'd never used before, using my company's Chicago office as the address. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a small act of self-preservation in the face of what I now recognized as an existential threat. 3 excruciatingly long weeks later, Diana delivered her preliminary report. Michael arranged for us to meet in a private room at his club, where no one would recognize me or overhear our conversation. Diana placed a thick folder on the mahogany table between us. "I'm afraid it's worse than you suspected," she said without preamble. She opened the folder to reveal a series of photographs, documents, and financial records. Sarah Coleman is not her real name. She's Sarah Donahue, age 39, not 37 as she claims. She was born in Philadelphia, not Seattle. There's no record of her attending Vassar or any other college. In fact, her education appears to end with a GED obtained in Maryland. She slid forward a series of newspaper clippings and court documents. She has a history of at least 3 previous marriages to wealthy men, each ending in messy, financially devastating divorces for her ex-husbands. I stared at the wedding photos in disbelief. Sarah in different dresses, with different hair colors, standing beside different men, all with the same practiced smile I'd found so genuine when directed at me. Gerald Hoffman, Chicago, 2009 to 2011. Technology executive. lost approximately $4.3 million in the divorce and subsequent lawsuits, Diana recited clinically. Robert Mercer, Atlanta, 2011 to 2013. Real estate developer. Lost his company and primary residence. Filed for bankruptcy in 2014. She paused before continuing. Victor Castillo, Miami, 2014 to 2015. Brief marriage. He died of an apparent heart attack before any divorce proceedings. Medical examiner found nothing suspicious, but he'd changed his will 6 months into the marriage. She inherited approximately $12 million. Jesus, I whispered, staring at the smiling face of a dead man, Sarah's arm wrapped possessively around his shoulders. The art consulting business is largely fictional, Diana continued. She knows enough to be convincing. She worked as an assistant at galleries in Philadelphia and New York in her 20s, but she has never been a legitimate consultant. The office space she rents downtown is used primarily for meetings with co-conspirators. She handed me another set of documents. Most damning of all, we've traced transfers from your joint accounts to offshore holdings in the Caymans, Singapore, and Belize. Approximately $1.8 million has been moved over the past 8 months. Michael, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. There's evidence of wire fraud, identity theft, and possible tax evasion. This goes beyond a bad marriage, James. The woman you married is running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. I sat back, feeling as though I'd been physically struck. It was one thing to suspect my wife was planning to divorce me and take some of my money. It was entirely another to discover I'd married a career criminal who had potentially murdered her previous husband. What do I do now? I asked, my voice barely audible. Michael and Diana exchanged glances. That depends on what you want the outcome to be, Michael said carefully. If you just want out with minimal financial damage, we can file for divorce immediately, freeze the accounts, and try to recover what's been taken. And if I want more than that? I asked, a coldness settling into my chest where warmth and trust had once resided. Then we build a case, Diana said, her eyes meeting mine steadily. We document everything. We identify her co-conspirators. We work with authorities to ensure that Sarah Donahue, or whatever her real name is, never does this to anyone else. I looked down at the scattered evidence of my wife's deception, at the faces of the men who had come before me. Men who had probably sat in rooms very similar to this one, experiencing the same shattering of reality I was now enduring. Build the case, I said firmly. I want everything you can get on her and whoever she's working with. The woman I'd married was a professional con artist who had targeted me from the beginning, and for the first time since discovering her betrayal, I felt something beyond shock and pain. I felt resolve. My first instinct was confrontation, to go home, throw the evidence in Sarah's face, and watch her carefully constructed world crumble. But years of business negotiations had taught me better. Emotional reactions rarely yield optimal outcomes. Instead, I consulted with Michael about the best approach from both legal and personal perspectives. Don't let her know you're onto her, Michael advised as we sat in his office late into the evening. We need time to gather more evidence and protect your assets. If she gets wind of the investigation, she'll accelerate her plans or create new problems you haven't anticipated. I'm not sure how long I can maintain this charade, I admitted, the thought of continuing to share a home, a bed, with Sarah making my skin crawl. Every moment I spend with her feels like a violation now. Michael's expression softened with sympathy. I understand, but think of it this way. The longer you can maintain the status quo, the stronger our position will be when we finally move. We're not just trying to end a marriage here. We're trying to build a case that will stop her from doing this to someone else after you. He was right, of course. This wasn't just about my financial security or even justice for myself. It was about preventing future victims, about ensuring that Sarah faced consequences severe enough to end her criminal career permanently. For the next 2 months, I lived a double life that would have impressed the most seasoned undercover agent. At home, I played the oblivious, loving husband while secretly documenting everything. I noted every inconsistency in her stories, recorded the dates and times of her mysterious client meetings, and kept meticulous records of her spending patterns that I hired forensic accountants recommended by Diana to trace every dollar that had moved through our joint accounts. They worked discreetly, using techniques that wouldn't alert Sarah or her associates that the transfers were being investigated. Following legal advice from Michael, I installed security cameras in our home office. Massachusetts is a two-party consent state for audio recording, but video surveillance in one's own home is legal as long as it's not in areas where there's an expectation of privacy, like bathrooms or bedrooms. The cameras captured Sarah accessing my personal computer, photographing documents from my briefcase, and making calls during which she discussed the plan with various associates. While Sarah believed I was focused on a major company expansion, I was carefully beginning to protect what assets I could. I made legitimate business trips to Chicago, New York, and London, using each opportunity to establish new accounts untraceable to my usual banking relationships. I transferred small amounts, nothing that would raise flags in our joint accounts, but enough to create a financial cushion independent of Sarah's reach that I consulted with additional attorneys specializing in asset recovery and fraud, building a team that would be ready to move simultaneously on multiple fronts when the time came. Every professional I worked with was bound by strict confidentiality agreements and understood the sensitivity of the situation that Diana's investigation continued to yield disturbing results. She identified 3 primary accomplices working with Sarah: a disbarred attorney who provided legal documents with forged signatures, a finance professional who facilitated the offshore transfers, and a private investigator who had likely been used to identify me as a potential target in the first place. Most disturbingly, she uncovered communications suggesting that Sarah had already consulted with a divorce attorney of her own, one with a reputation for aggressive tactics and questionable ethics. They had mapped out a strategy that included claims of emotional abuse, accusations of hidden assets, and threats to go public with manufactured improprieties that would damage my company's reputation. She's planning to file within the next 60 days, Diana reported, showing me emails recovered through methods I chose not to inquire about. The strategy is to blindside you, create a media narrative that portrays you as an abusive husband and fraudulent businessman, and use the resulting chaos to push through a settlement favorable to her before you can mount an effective defense. The hardest part of this period was maintaining the facade at home. Each night I'd sit across from her at dinner, smiling and discussing our day, knowing she was plotting to destroy me. I'd listen to her talk about fictional client meetings or gallery openings, nodding with interest at stories I now knew were complete fabrications. When she suggested a second anniversary trip to Bali, I agreed enthusiastically while knowing that her plan likely involved creating opportunities for more significant fund transfers while I was relaxed and distracted. I even began leaving my laptop unlocked occasionally, with carefully crafted emails. By the 8th week of this charade, all the pieces were in place. The forensic accountants had traced the majority of the transferred funds. Diana had compiled comprehensive dossiers on Sarah and her accomplices. Michael had prepared divorce filings that included extensive evidence of fraud. Federal authorities had been quietly notified of the financial crimes, though they were waiting for our civil proceedings to be initiated before taking action. All that remained was to determine the right moment to spring the trap. The opportunity presented itself when Sarah mentioned her desire to host a dinner party for our 2nd anniversary. "Just our closest friends," she said, chopping vegetables for dinner one evening. "Michael and Elena, Adrian and Thomas, and I thought I'd invite the Andersons. They're interested in working with Williams Financial for their family office." The Andersons, Richard and Marlene, were a wealthy couple new to Boston whom Sarah had recently introduced me to at a charity gala. They had seemed oddly familiar with details of my business, asking targeted questions about our client verification procedures and minimum investment thresholds. Now, understanding Sarah's methods, I suspected they were either her next intended victims or, more likely, confederates in her scheme. "That sounds perfect," I said, refilling our wine glasses. "We haven't entertained in too long." As Sarah smiled and continued planning the menu, I sent a discreet text to Michael. Target date set. Anniversary dinner, 3 weeks from Saturday. All players will be present. His response came moments later. Confirmed. We'll be ready. For the next 3 weeks, preparations accelerated. Final documentation was assembled, court filings were prepared but held, and federal authorities were briefed on the timeline. "Sarah, meanwhile, seemed increasingly excited about the dinner party, taking unusual care with every detail from the menu to the floral arrangements to the seating chart. The night before the dinner, as we lay in bed, she propped herself up on one elbow and gazed at me with what I once would have interpreted as affection. "I can't believe it's been 2 years," she said, trailing her fingers along my arm. "You've made me so happy, James." I looked into her eyes I now knew had watched other men with the same practiced warmth before calculating their downfall, and summoned every ounce of acting ability I possessed. "These have been the best 2 years of my life," I replied, bringing her hand to my lips. "I can't wait to celebrate tomorrow." She smiled, seemingly satisfied with my response, and settled against my chest. As her breathing slowed into sleep, I stared at the ceiling, mentally rehearsing the sequence of events that would unfold the next day. Events that would end this charade once and for all. The anniversary dinner would be the perfect stage. Not only would Sarah's accomplices be present, but also my most trusted friends, who would serve as witnesses to what was about to unfold. The timing couldn't have been better. Catching her before she could file her fraudulent divorce papers while gathering all the players in one location. As dawn broke, I sent a final confirmation text to Michael, Diana, and the rest of my team. Everything was in place. The trap was set. All that remained was for Sarah to walk into it. The day of our anniversary arrived with perfect autumn weather that mirrored the day we'd met 2 years earlier. Sarah spent the morning directing the catering staff and arranging flowers, seemingly oblivious to the fact that this elaborate dinner she was organizing would become the scene of her own undoing. "The Andersons confirmed their coming," she mentioned casually as she inspected the table settings. "Richard seemed particularly eager to discuss that investment opportunity with you." "I'm looking forward to it," I replied, adjusting my tie in the hallway mirror. I caught her watching me with that calculating look I now recognized all too well. She had no idea that I'd run a thorough background check on the Andersons, confirming my suspicion that they were, in fact, not a wealthy couple but accomplices in her scheme. Richard Anderson's real name was Richard Donovan, and he had a record of financial fraud in 3 states. By 7 o'clock, our brownstone was transformed for the evening ahead. Candles flickered throughout the dining room, casting a warm glow over the impeccably set table. A small ensemble played soft jazz in the corner of the living room, and waitstaff circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Michael and Elena arrived first, Michael giving me a subtle nod that communicated everything was in place. Adrian and Thomas followed shortly after. And finally, the Andersons, or rather, the Donovans, arrived bearing an ostentatious gift and effusive compliments about our home. Throughout the cocktail hour, I played my part perfectly. The successful, slightly oblivious husband, completely unaware of the storm about to break. Sarah seemed in her element, laughing and charming our guests, occasionally touching my arm or catching my eye across the room with what appeared to be genuine affection. As we moved to the dining room, I noted with grim satisfaction that everyone was seated according to my specifications, a detail Sarah believed had been her idea. At precisely 8:30 p.m., as the main course was being served, my phone rang with a prearranged call. "I'm so sorry," I said, glancing at the screen. "It's the Tokyo office. I need to take this. Please start without me." I stepped into the study, closed the door, and waited. 30 seconds later, right on schedule, the doorbell rang. Sarah, acting as the perfect hostess, would answer it, expecting a late-arriving guest or perhaps a delivery from my position in the study. I heard the front door open, followed by Sarah's confused voice. "Can I help you?" "Sarah Donahue," came a firm female voice, Diana Reeves, accompanied by 2 federal agents and a court officer. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." I re-entered the dining room just as Diana was leading a shell-shocked Sarah back inside, federal agents flanking them. Our guests froze in various poses of surprise. Michael and Elena with expressions of carefully controlled satisfaction, Adrian and Thomas genuinely shocked, and the false Andersons looking like cornered animals. "What is happening?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising with the perfect pitch of outraged innocence. "James, tell them there's been a mistake." I walked to the head of the table, my heart pounding but my voice steady. "There's no mistake, Sarah. Or should I call you by your real name? I turned to our guests. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Sarah Donahue, professional con artist and serial predator of wealthy men. The color drained from Sarah's face as I methodically laid out the evidence. Her previous identities, her past victims, the offshore accounts where she'd hidden stolen funds, and her plans to destroy me financially through a fraudulent divorce. As I spoke, federal agents moved to detain Richard and Marlene Anderson, who had tried to slip quietly toward the exit. Michael produced a file containing court documents, divorce papers filed that morning, along with injunctions freezing all our joint accounts, and evidence of Sarah's criminal activities. This is ridiculous, Sarah hissed, her mask of refinement slipping entirely as she realized the depth of the trap. You have nothing. Diana stepped forward, tablet in hand. Actually, we have everything, Mrs. Donahue Williams, including video of you accessing Mr. Williams' private files, audio recordings of your planning sessions with your accomplices, and a complete paper trail of the money you've illegally transferred. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, calculating, before settling on me with a gaze of pure venom. You think you're so clever, she spat. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I'll destroy you. By the time my lawyers are finished, you'll wish you'd never met me. That ship has already sailed, I replied calmly. And as for lawyers, I think you'll find your usual attorney, Mr. Delaney, unavailable. He's being questioned by the Bar Association Ethics Committee as we speak, regarding his role in your various schemes. As the federal agents read Sarah her rights and led her and the Donovans from our home, our genuine friends surrounded me with support. Elena hugged me tightly, whispering, I'm so sorry you had to go through this alone. Not alone, I corrected her, nodding to Michael. I had the best team possible. Later that evening, after everyone had gone and the remnants of the aborted celebration had been cleared away, I sat alone in the study with a glass of scotch, feeling a complex mixture of emotions: relief, vindication, lingering anger, and an unexpected sadness for what I had believed was real. Michael called around midnight with an update. She's been formally charged and denied bail, he reported. The Donovans are cooperating, hoping for leniency. They've already implicated several other accomplices. And the money? I asked, the businessman in me still concerned about the financial damage. We've filed emergency motions to locate and freeze all accounts connected to her. The forensic accountants believe we can recover about 60% of what she took. The rest. He paused. Well, recovering something is better than nothing. It's not about the money anymore, I said, realizing as I spoke that it was true. It's about making sure she never does this to anyone else. The following months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. The divorce case moved swiftly through the courts, with Sarah's fraudulent activities nullifying any claims she might have made under normal circumstances. My legal team presented overwhelming evidence of her deception, including the forged documents, unauthorized transfers, and calculated manipulation. The criminal case proceeded on a parallel track. As Diana had predicted, once the initial charges were filed, additional victims came forward. 2 more men from Sarah's past emerged with stories similar to mine, each one systematically deceived, financially drained, and emotionally devastated. The most disturbing development came 3 months after her arrest, when authorities reopened the investigation into Victor Castillo's death. New toxicology tests, ordered based on the pattern of Sarah's activities, revealed trace amounts of a substance that could have induced cardiac arrest, not enough to definitively prove murder, but sufficient to add attempted homicide to the growing list of charges against her. Throughout the proceedings, Sarah maintained her innocence with the same convincing performance that had once captivated me. She appeared in court impeccably dressed, tears welling in her eyes as she claimed to be the victim of a vindictive husband and overzealous prosecution. James was controlling, obsessive, she told the court during her testimony. When I finally found the courage to leave, he fabricated these ridiculous charges to punish me. But the evidence told a different story. Bank records, surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and her own documented communications painted a clear picture of a calculated, long-term criminal enterprise. The divorce was finalized 6 months after her arrest, with the judge voiding any claims she had to my assets and ordering restitution for the funds she had stolen. The prenuptial agreement I'd insisted upon, which she had planned to circumvent through claims of commingled assets, now served as additional protection against her claims. The criminal trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified for 2 full days, methodically recounting every step of Sarah's deception and my subsequent investigation. As I spoke, I avoided looking directly at her, focusing instead on the jury, 12 ordinary people who seemed increasingly disturbed by the calculated nature of her crimes. In his closing argument, the prosecutor described Sarah and her accomplices as predators who weaponize intimacy, who turn the sacred trust of marriage into a mechanism for theft and exploitation. He displayed photographs of her with each of her victims, including me, pointing out the pattern of deception that had ruined lives across multiple states. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts: wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, money laundering, and attempted manslaughter in the Castillo case. As the foreman read the verdicts, I watched Sarah's face, seeing for the first time the mask completely drop, revealing the cold calculation beneath. The judge, clearly disgusted by the evidence presented during trial, sentenced her to 28 years in federal prison, with additional consecutive sentences for the financial crimes. These were not crimes of passion or necessity, he stated during sentencing. These were calculated acts of predation against individuals whose only crime was trusting you. The court cannot allow such a systematic abuse of trust to go unpunished. As she was led from the courtroom, Sarah locked eyes with me one final time. There was no remorse in her gaze, only a cold fury at having been outplayed at her own game. I held her stare until the doors closed behind her, ending one of the most painful chapters of my life. In the years following Sarah's conviction, I worked to rebuild both my financial portfolio and my capacity for trust. The recovery process was neither quick nor easy. About 60% of the stolen funds were eventually recovered through asset seizures and forfeiture proceedings. Though some had been moved through so many layers of offshore accounts that they proved impossible to trace, Williams Financial not only survived the scandal but thrived, partly due to the transparency with which I addressed the situation. Rather than hiding what had happened, I shared the experience with clients and colleagues, using it as an object lesson in the importance of due diligence and the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance or charm. If it could happen to me, I often told nervous investors, it could happen to anyone. But lightning rarely strikes twice in the same place. The most difficult recovery was emotional. For months after Sarah's conviction, I found myself analyzing every interaction, questioning every new acquaintance's motives. I sought therapy to address the trauma of such profound betrayal, working through the complex grief of losing something that had never actually existed except in my mind. 3 years after Sarah's sentencing, I received a letter from Diana Reeves, who had moved on to a position with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. "I thought you might want to know," she wrote. "Sarah Donahue has been connected to at least 3 additional cases similar to yours. The information you provided has helped us build a database of similar predators and their methods. Your willingness to come forward despite the personal embarrassment has quite literally prevented others from becoming victims." That letter marked a turning point in my healing process. The idea that my painful experience might spare others the same fate gave meaning to what had otherwise seemed like a pointless exercise in humiliation and loss. 5 years after the divorce, I met Catherine at a conference on sustainable investing in Vancouver. Unlike Sarah, who had approached me with practice charm and hidden agenda, Catherine challenged me from our first conversation, disagreeing with my assessment of emerging market opportunities and backing her position with data I hadn't considered. Our relationship developed slowly, built on genuine shared interests and mutual respect rather than calculated manipulation. When I finally told her the full story of my marriage to Sarah, she listened without judgment. "That must have been awful," she said simply. "But it also showed incredible strength, the way you handled it, not letting it destroy your capacity to trust." "I'm not sure that capacity survived intact," I admitted. "You're here with me," she pointed out. That took courage. We married a year later in a small ceremony in her hometown of Portland. No elaborate social event, no performance for an audience, just a genuine commitment between 2 people who had come to know and respect each other. As for Sarah, I heard she attempted to maintain her network of criminal associates from prison, but without her charismatic presence to hold them together, the operation fell apart. Her appeals were denied, and the separate charges from other jurisdictions ensured that she would remain incarcerated well into her 60s. Occasionally, I would receive notifications from the Victim Services Office about her case: denied parole applications, failed appeals, disciplinary actions for continued manipulation of fellow inmates, and even guards. Each time, I filed the letters away without response. Sarah had occupied enough of my mental and emotional energy. She would get no more. Today, 8 years after that fateful anniversary dinner, I run a significantly expanded Williams Financial, now with offices in 6 cities. Catherine and I have 2 children who have never heard the name Sarah Donahue, and who hopefully will grow up with the balanced sense of trust and caution that I had to learn through painful experience. I still have the watch, that $50,000 Patek Philippe that Sarah gave me as manipulation in the final weeks of our marriage. I keep it in a desk drawer, unworn, as a reminder, not of her, but of my own resilience. It marks the time between who I was, a man so convinced of his own judgment that he couldn't imagine being deceived, and who I've become, someone who understands. That trust must be earned through actions over time, not granted based on appearances or charm. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, watching the second hand move steadily forward, marking the passage of time and the healing it brings. There's a certain poetry in that. The gift meant to blind me now serves as a reminder to keep my eyes open. The hard-won wisdom from my experience with Sarah has become part of me, not as a burden of suspicion, but as a foundation for more authentic relationships built on genuine trust rather than illusion. In the end, that may be the only true justice any of us can hope for, not just punishment for those who harm us, but the growth that allows us to move beyond the harm and build something better. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more real-life accounts of betrayal and its consequences. Remember, these stories are shared not to promote vengeance, but to illustrate the human capacity for resilience. In the face of profound betrayal, sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even, it's about getting better.